This video is brought to you by Squarespace. In 1923, F. Scott Fitzgerald was drowning. Fitzgerald was basically a jazz age influencer, and was so much an icon of the times that he'd practically named the decade. While the novelist had nearly everything he'd ever wanted, the desire for more threatened to bring everything to a screeching halt. Mainly because he wasn't writing novels anymore. After making his name with jazzy stories about carefree flappers, Fitzgerald set them aside to write something that would make him rich forever. A surreal 3-act play about drinking so much bootleg alcohol it causes an existential crisis. But now, time and money were running out. If Fitzgerald didn't finish the play soon, he would literally be forced to pawn his furniture. This is a story of alcohol and ambition, of decadence and desperation, and of a man named Bunny. This is the story of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Vegetable.
You know, old sport, I'm an expert when it comes to hosting the hottest parties in town. But building my own website? Now that's a green light even I couldn't reach. With how up and down my industry is, I only trust Squarespace. With Squarespace's easy-to-use design tools, extravagant templates, and customer management tools, I can create a stunning website without looking like a beautiful little fool. So head to squarespace.com/waitinthewings and use code waitinthewings to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain.
In 1920, F. Scott Fitzgerald was swimming in champagne. His debut novel, This Side of Paradise, completely sold out, and he was officially the youngest author in the history of his publisher, Scribner's. At just 23 years old, Fitzgerald was a literal overnight sensation. He rode the wave of popularity and sold short stories and one-act plays to magazines and newspapers. The pay for these stories climbed from $30 to $400 to at least $10,000 in today's money. With a spot on every bestseller list and on the New York World's handsomest male authors list came invites to the hottest parties in New York. Alcohol might have been illegal, but that didn't stop Fitzgerald. Between the roaring decadence, Fitzgerald found time to scrapbook, and he meticulously clipped and pasted each short story, each review, every single mention of himself, and the humble pleas for his next work. Tucked to the side in one of these scrapbooks, one of the writer's favorite magazines made a request.
I hope that young F. Scott Fitzgerald will turn to the 3-act form one of these days.
The idea of the author writing a 3-act play wasn't as unusual as it sounded. Before he became F. Scott Fitzgerald the novelist, he was F. Scott Fitzgerald the musical theater nerd.
Plays and screenwriting are a through line throughout his career. Even though obviously, it's not what he's known for or what he's famous for. I am Mark Taylor, and I give walking tours of F. Scott Fitzgerald's St. Paul neighborhood.
Even as a very young teenager in St. Paul, he'd written plays that were produced in the summers. My name is Jackson Bryer. I'm president of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Society.
Fitzgerald's love for theater continued into his years at Princeton University.
He wrote 3 Triangle Club shows, or at least 3, I think 3. He wrote the book and lyrics, yeah.
Some of his classics for the Ivy League musical comedy group included lyrics like, "The vampires won't vampire for me," and songs like "One Lump Percy." Audiences and newspapers of the 1910s ate these things up. The Louisville Post even went so far as to declare that Fitzgerald could take his place right now with the brightest and best writers of witty lyrics in America. Roughly 6 years later, Fitzgerald returned home to St. Paul a celebrity, with a new book and a new baby on the way. After the release of his second novel, The Beautiful and Damned, Fitzgerald decided to take a swing at another big project. He was going to write what he called a play which is to make my fortune.
He loved entertainments. He wanted the most people to come to the thing that he made. He wanted desperately to have a hit on Broadway.
He wanted to be a playwright. He wanted to be talked about. He wanted to keep his career going in that way. And what he was looking for was continuing income.
While the author's novels took inspiration from snobbish Ivy League culture, his new play, Gabriel's Trombone, more closely resembled his one-lump Percy days, with comedic dialogue and the occasional stupid gag. This was at a time when Broadway was coming into its own. New theaters popped up left and right, filled with shows by soon-to-be iconic playwrights. Fitzgerald showed an early draft to Edmund "Bunny" Wilson, his Princeton Triangle Club pal who had since become an esteemed New York literary critic. Bunny wasn't known for being a gentle critic, even towards his friends. So it came with great shock when he called Fitzgerald's draft of the play marvelous. No doubt the best American comedy ever written.
And it's like, okay, how many plays have you read, Edmund? It's like, have you heard of like The Importance of Being Earnest?
Moreover, Bunny felt so enthusiastic about the show that he started reaching out to producers personally. Week after week, Fitzgerald received updates from Bunny. The critic was practically sure of having it produced somehow. But each new letter brought new rejections.
He was so hot at that time, I find it really hard to believe that there wasn't a Broadway producer who was just willing to roll the dice and be like, it's Fitzgerald, it's kind of jazzy, there's like flappers and, bootleggers, like, oh yeah, the second act's kind of weird, but I'll take a chance on it.
On a backroom stage at Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich, a new art form emerged: Dada. The artist Hugo Ball emerged in what today looks like a Chef Boyardee cosplay and spoke a made-up language. The act was completely ridiculous, but that was by design. As an underground art movement, Dada thrived on nonsense over convention, a sensibility Fitzgerald infused directly into his play. In Act 1, Jerry Frost, a railroad employee, gets absolutely smashed on bootlegged alcohol the night before Warren Harding is elected President of the United States. Pretty normal fare, right? Yeah, just wait. Act 2 abandons traditional theater and goes full Dada. In an early draft, Jerry is the president in a sequence that includes cans of worms getting thrown at bird people in trenches, dentist appointments canceled due to the end of the world, and a father literally named Dada. The play ends with Jerry Frost missing, only for the audience to learn that he left his wife and a steady job with the railroad to become a postman. The end. The play was unlike anything Fitzgerald wrote before. Unlike his novels, which flowed with melancholy lines, his play included eloquent prose like this line from the bootlegger better known as the Honorable Snooks. "The end of the world, eh? It's the end of the world for Sandy Claus. You gotta come across with the state of Idaho." As if the dialogue wasn't confusing enough, full pages of the script were stage directions. So much so that Fitzgerald himself essentially said that the stage play was meant to be read, not performed. The play needed help. So Fitzgerald turned to the person he always turned to when he got stuck. Zelda Sayer was the quintessential flapper. Modern and unconventional, Zelda and Scott Fitzgerald got married 8 days after his first book was published. Scott frequently borrowed uncredited lines from Zelda's letters, diaries, and even something she said under anesthesia when their daughter was born.
I mean, she was definitely the silent partner in a lot of what he did, and his muse, which is a really complicated idea.
The Fitzgeralds also collaborated happily. Most recently, the pair had written a parody newspaper for The Bad Luck Ball, complete with headlines declaring things like "Jazz Janitor has good Xmas" and ads for ancient saxophones. But now, they got to work fixing the play. How much of the final version was Zelda's? We'll probably never know. But what we do know is that as F. Scott Fitzgerald continued tweaking the play in St. Paul, Bunny continued unsuccessful chats with producers in New York City. Despite it all, Fitzgerald could barely contain his enthusiasm for the new second act. Writing to Bunny Wilson, "It is now a wonder. I'm going to ask you to destroy the 2 copies you have, as it makes me nervous to have them out." With the play officially finished, Fitzgerald's editor, Max Perkins, finally agreed to give it a read. Perkins represented some of the biggest authors of the time. Given that Scribner's magazine usually published literature, Perkins warned Fitzgerald that it would be most unusual for them to publish a play. But there were no rules against it. That vague response was good enough for Scott and Zelda. They needed to move back to New York, to be closer to Broadway. Weeks later, the Fitzgeralds moved into a cottage on Gateway Drive in Great Neck, Long Island. It wasn't nearly as big as the colossal mansions of their neighbors, but it was an easy commute to the Scribner's office on Fifth Avenue, and to Manhattan's blossoming theater district.
And he made a lot of connections there with people in the theater world too, which again makes it surprising that somebody didn't want to produce it, but oh well.
The Fitzgeralds hoped to be more responsible during their time in Great Neck. But a little party never killed nobody. Fitzgerald and his new neighbor drank on the porch and gazed across the bay, where they could see an almost continuous house party next door. In between absolute ragers, Fitzgerald managed to rework his near-perfect play, which he retitled to Frost, a pun on the lead character's last name. But it was also a nod to Frost Pharmacy, which was a spot Fitzgerald frequented in St. Paul to buy cigarettes and bootleg liquor. That December, Max Perkins read the play 3 times before sending Fitzgerald a long letter. Perkins went on to say he was afraid that the reader would feel, at the end, confused and unsatisfied. But Fitzgerald's optimism overshadowed Perkins' hesitations. And that April, the play was finally published under yet another name, The Vegetable, or From President to Postman. The play's final title took inspiration from a problematic quote that Fitzgerald pulled from a so-called current magazine. An inscription at the front of the book declared, "Any man who doesn't want to get on in the world, to make $1 million, and maybe even park his toothbrush in the White House, hasn't got as much to him as a good dog has. He's nothing more or less than a vegetable."
Wilson told him he thought it was the best thing he'd ever written. He reviewed it in Vanity Fair, which was one of the leading literary magazines of the day. It's one of the best things Fitzgerald has done. I'm trying to think of what the equivalent of that would be today, but that would be as if a major literary critic reviewed a play positively. I mean, he was a real taste setter in his day, Wilson.
About a month after the play was published, Fitzgerald wrote 2 letters. Both are undated. In one, he wrote about how the producer Sam Harris had taken The Vegetable for a fall production, and how he was very much excited. But this excitement starkly contrasted another letter in which Fitzgerald confessed reservations that he didn't want to have the play produced at all until he could rewrite it. Regardless, the contract with Sam Harris was signed that July. The groundbreaking play finally had a producer and plans for a November production, whether Fitzgerald actually wanted it to or not. The Fitzgeralds' extravagance was catching up with them. In his hope-filled mission to get the vegetable to Broadway, Fitzgerald completely neglected the writing that actually made him money: short stories and his next novel. The only thing that mattered was getting the play staged. But Fitzgerald needed cash, desperately. In 1923, Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald made an astonishing $29,565, which was 8 times more than the average American household, according to the IRS. But they spent a whole lot more too, blowing through $36,000 on expenses like restaurant parties, entertaining, and miscellaneous pleasures. Running out of money and time, Fitzgerald even begged his editor, Max Perkins, for help, stating, "I've got myself into a terrible mess. If I don't in some way get $650 in the bank by Wednesday morning, I'll have to pawn the furniture." As the bills stacked up, Fitzgerald knew there was an answer coming to his money problems: the play. Fitzgerald surveyed playwrights and decided that he could confidently count on $100,000 of income from a year-long run on Broadway. As Fitzgerald wrote, "All I have to do is deposit the $100,000 from my play, and then we're through with worry forever." In 1923, Fitzgerald and his long-anticipated play finally came to life on stage at Nixon's Apollo Theater. Only, it wasn't on Broadway. It was 130 miles away in Atlantic City.
They were proud of this show, and they invited people to come down and play in Atlantic City, which was not just a Broadway tryout place, but very much a party venue outside of New York, where Prohibition was very much disregarded. My name is Anne Margaret Daniel, and I've been writing about Fitzgerald since the early 1990s.
On November 19th, 1923, the vegetable finally opened to a roaring audience. It was a roar of boos.
I'm currently working on Zelda Fitzgerald's Selected Letters, and here is a portion of a letter that she wrote in November of 1923. The first act went fine, but Ernest says he has never had an experience on the stage like the second.
The audience hated the show, to the point that many even stormed out.
I doubt people walked out in Act 1. They probably started walking out in Act 2 when it got crazy.
Just as Perkins feared, the improved second act still left audiences confused and unsatisfied.
Scott suggested fixing it by having Ernest's teeth fall out when he heard about the Buzzard Islands, but I don't think anybody liked the suggestion but us.
It's a whole vibe, as the kids these days say.
The response in the theater was so negative that some believe even Fitzgerald himself joined in on the booing. In the words of Fitzgerald, it was a colossal frost, but he still tried everything he could to save it.
Fitzgerald was a very assertive playwright, and it would have been difficult for him to step to the side and let somebody else take control.
He has a way with words and a way with story that is really unparalleled, but at the same time, he also had an incredible ego.
Fitzgerald's struggles to collaborate weren't new. At Princeton, he consistently undersold his classmates' contributions and made snarky asides anytime they received praise. But in Atlantic City, he had no one to blame but himself. Fitzgerald's self-proclaimed wasted year and a half dashed any hopes of the play making it to Broadway, and of the author receiving his optimistic $100,000 payday. Between racked up debt and no new works, Fitzgerald now needed even more money, and he needed it fast. The writer needed to write. Fitzgerald nestled into a small space above his garage, cranked the space heater, and wrote like his life depended on it. Fitzgerald wrote a flood of short stories. One of them was called How to Live on $36,000 a Year. It sold for twice as much as the play's total income. By spring, Scott and Zelda financially defrosted just enough to pack up and head to Europe. The couple hoped to leave the distractions and disappointments of Great Neck in the past. Under the warmth of the French sun, Fitzgerald finally had the time and money to write the novel he had long set aside. On April 10, 1925, F. Scott Fitzgerald finally published The Great Gatsby. On April 12, 1925, the New York World ran the headline, F. Scott Fitzgerald's latest, a dud. Despite a play version briefly running on Broadway, of which Fitzgerald had no involvement, the novel was destined to fade into obscurity. But surprisingly, after the publication of The Great Gatsby, productions of The Vegetable launched in Baltimore in 1925 and California in 1928. But they both faced the same response: a short run and an utter flop. 7 years after he started writing the show, The Vegetable finally made it to New York City when it opened off-Broadway at the Cherry Lane Theater on April 10th, 1929. It only ran for 13 performances. Everything in F. Scott Fitzgerald's life was declining. His health, his marriage, his career. His novel sales were non-existent. His books no longer carried in stores. In August of 1939, the author ordered a copy of The Vegetable. It was the only copy sold that year. F. Scott Fitzgerald died a year and a half later. But then, in 1942, the Council of Books in Wartime started distributing special paperback books to soldiers fighting in World War II. The list included Moby Dick, The Grapes of Wrath, and 155,000 copies of The Great Gatsby.
Edmund Wilson ended up being one of the main people who made the decision to send The Great Gatsby to the soldiers in World War II.
By the end of the war, Fitzgerald was back in the spotlight, but The Vegetable remained in the shadows.
It's certainly forgotten. Even in the Fitzgerald world, we very seldom talk about it.
During my 30 years of writing about Fitzgerald, nobody's gotten in touch with me about it.
You know, The Vegetable is just such a little forgotten footnote kind of in his career.
There's some people who see this play as a very ahead of its time sort of play.
The Vegetable is not a lost masterpiece. The things that are supposed to be funny have been lost in time. It's 100 years now.
The Vegetable is all but forgotten, even by Fitzgerald scholars. But why? Maybe The Vegetable was ahead of its time. Or maybe The Vegetable was just a bad play. But that doesn't mean it deserves to be forgotten. Yes, The Vegetable was far from a commercial success, but so was The Great Gatsby. And yet 100 years later, Gatsby continues to beat on. It's so easy to look at failure as a bad thing. But think about it. Without The Vegetable, Fitzgerald probably never would have written about a Midwest drugstore owner who made his money bootlegging grain alcohol, or about a young man moving into a humble cottage alongside colossal mansions in Great Neck, or of the continuous house parties across the bay, or of a man named Wilson. It is entirely possible that the great American novel wouldn't have happened without the great American flop. But The Vegetable isn't the only time a flop led to something remarkable. Check out this video to learn more about Jonathan Larson's wild sci-fi space musical that somehow helped create Rent. And support the channel on Patreon to help us continue making these documentaries.